Welcome, you're on The Fringe Show. I'm your host, Tatiana Zalan, and I go live every Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. The Fringe helps you to navigate the rapidly changing world and increase the odds of your success. Here we discuss technology, startups, and mental models of successful people so that you too can take advantage of the opportunities in the new digital world. It's a bit of a milestone for me today. It's my show number 50, episode number 50, and I decided to dedicate it to a review of the book. I was on a vacation for some time, and it was time for me to read a couple of books, and one of them was The Network State, How to Start a New Country by Balaji Srinivasan, which was one of the most anticipated books releases of 2022, particularly in the tech community and beyond the tech community as well. And its key argument is that you can start a country and actually a nation from your computer, just like you do with your startup. And you can build a digital first and physical second. So it's a very, very interesting set of ideas. And I decided to do justice to this book, which is packed with very different ideas. I decided to split it into two parts. Mark Andreessen, in particular, who wrote a very quick review of the book, said that Balaji has the highest rate of output per minute of good new ideas of anybody I've ever met, and the network state may be his best. So co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, Mark Andreessen, pioneer of the internet, said that. And yes, indeed, it's packed with ideas. So I thought it would probably be better if I split it in two parts. So today, in today's episode, I will review two first chapters of the book, which is Quickstart and History as Trajectory. Before we go any further, my usual disclaimer is that the views that I'm presenting here that do not represent the official views of organizations and employers I'm associated with. And although we'll mention cryptocurrency and Bitcoin quite a few times, just like Balaji Srinivasan does, this is not investment advice. The Fringe Show is for informational and educational reasons only and purposes. I want to start a little bit off the topic first because I want to put this book in a broader context. And the broader context is that we see that capitalism as a system has collapsed, really. And what we want to see is a new vision of the future. And it was in kind of my interest to, as a person who is interested and professionally and really as an individual, as a citizen in the future and what the future holds, what are the possible scenarios that our civilization might travel to, then I thought, well, does this book qualify for a new vision of the future? And it would be very good if it does. Let me maybe start with Emanuel Wallerstein, who in 2013 wrote a number of articles on capitalism as a system. He's an American sociologist and economic historian, very famous for his work into capitalism. He said that all systems have lives and they're never eternal, so they have finite lives, and approximately the system, the current one that we're in, lasted approximately 500 years, and it's operated under a certain set of rules and under certain characteristics. And probably the most dominant characteristic is the persistent search for the endless accumulation of capital, according to Wallerstein, the accumulation of capital in order to accumulate even more capital. So it lasted for 500 years, and in terms of its guiding principles in the endless accumulation of capital, it has done an extremely good job and has been extremely successful. But now the key question that we as civilization are confronting is about renovation of capitalism. That may include the strengthening of the role of the state, and this is what Keynes in particular talked about. Or it may be building something new, which is post-capitalism and for which we don't even have a name. And many, like Wallerstein, believe that the period of capitalism's ability to continue to operate on this basis has now come to an end, and because it has moved too far away from equilibrium. And we're now living this terminal stage of the systemic crisis of capitalism, as Andrei Fursov puts it. The old system is fading out, it's almost gone, and the new one has not yet arrived. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we are living amidst a struggle for the successor system. We are like a civilization in a search mode. And one kind of a possible new system may take some of the features of the present system, that's according to Wallerstein, like hierarchy, exploitation, and polarization. So it may be even worse than the current system. And then there is a vision, Wallerstein's vision, that the logical alternative to the system may be something relatively democratic and relatively egalitarian. And that latter has never existed yet, and it's only a possibility. So well, we've looked at what we are, the state we're in. What are the current contenders for visions of the future? Actually, Balaji Srinivasan in chapter 4 talks about different scenarios, in effect, visions of the future. So let's have a look at what we've got right now. And of course, I won't go through all of them. There are many, but I would argue that to get out of the current dark ages and to get through the next 30 years of chaos that are in front of us, we need a very compelling vision of the future. And I would argue it doesn't exist either in the West or East. And I'm really curious to see whether Balaji Srinivasan has something different to offer, even though he may not have set himself this objective to find an alternative to the current system. So what are the current contenders? Back to that. Well, one is transhumanism, the blending of humans and machines, which is based on the idea of singularity, leading to a world where we'll have two classes of humans, the augmented ones, that's the elites, and the rest of us. And that's very well detailed in the books like Ray Kurzweil's Singularity and Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. Then there is instrumentalism, which Shoshana Zuboff, Professor Zuboff, calls surveillance capitalism. Instrumentalism reimagines society as a hive which needs to be monitored and tuned for guaranteed outcomes. So these surveillance capitalists integrate society as a first-class object. It's not a subject anymore. It's really an object of computation, modification, monetization, and of course control. Empirically, it has been implemented in the Chinese social rating system. Then there is a range of visions like sustainable development, degrowth strategy, and they have their roots in the Club of Rome and the like, with other supranational organizations, that they have these notions of zero growth, anti-industrialization. They typically also include population control, population degrowth. Then there is a set of ideas under the banner of Great Reset and stakeholder capitalism, which belongs to the WEF and Klaus Schwab. Given that stakeholders have no property, this is not really capitalism. It's more like inclusive socialism. And inclusive capitalism in itself is an oxymoron, as capitalism by itself is exclusive. But it's not a renovation of capitalism, we need to understand with Great Reset. It's a radical reconstruction of the economic system and actually people, us humans, who inhabit this system. I won't go into any others. There are many others, but to me, all these visions are very regressive, dystopian, negative, and they give us humans nothing to aim for. And they, to paraphrase Archbishop Vigano, who was talking about Great Reset, are ontologically destined for failure because they're inhumane. Now, back to Balaji Srinivasan's nation state, and just to see how it all fits within this broader concept and context. Chapter 1, which is called Quick Starts, sets the scene, and I think what he's done is very, very clever. He's prepared one sentence, one image, 1,000 words, and one essay summaries of the concept, which are behind these startup societies and network states. Let's have a look at how he defines network society in one sentence, or network state. A network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing state. So that's a very a one sentence rather definition. He gives also a more complex definition that extends these concepts and covers many edge cases, as he says. A network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-founded physical territories, a virtual capital, and on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. And this idea of diplomatic recognition is really very important to Srinivasan. And I will explain later on why he thinks it's an important thing to have for a nation state. In one image, which is also in the first chapter, it's a picture. It depicts a network state with 1.7 million people, more than $157 billion in annual income, and 136 million square meter footprint. It's sprinkled all over the world. It's not in one place. This is not a contiguous territory. These are enclaves which are sprinkled all over the world, as I said. In his view, a network state is the sequel to the nation state. And what he wants to do is to peacefully start a new state for the same reason as he explains we want a bare plot of land, a blank sheet of paper, an empty text buffer, a fresh startup, or a clean state. So we want a clean state because we want to build something new without historical constraints. And he talks about historical constraints in chapter 2. There are 7 ways of starting a country: election, revolution, maybe war, micronation, seasteading, space, and particularly the preferred way to start a new country is the network state. That's the 7th way. The idea behind it all is to emphasize it cloud first and land last. Rather than starting with a physical territory, we start with a digital community. We create a startup society, he says, organize it into a network union, crowdfund the physical nodes of a network archipelago, and in time, eventually will negotiate diplomatic recognition to become a true network state. We build the embryonic state as an open source project. We organize our internal economy, he says, around remote work. We stimulate architecture in virtual reality, and we create art and literature that reflects our values. What I found wanting in the book, it wasn't really clear to me how this remote work will feed into this economy, internal economy or digital economy in the first place. So this is something that I'll probably discuss and comment on later as we'll cover the whole book. So that's really a point that's not clear to me, nor does he spell out how we need to create art and literature that reflects our values, and I think it's an important point to emphasize. So that's chapter 1. It's a brief chapter. And now we're on to second chapter, which is history as trajectory. It's a very conceptually dense chapter. It's very well evidenced. The whole book is very well evidenced. There are many, many ideas here. And it was really very difficult to distill what is really key. It was almost too long as a chapter. It could have been split into two, or even like a separate book on its own. But the key point here is that we can apply all the techniques of startup companies to startup societies. Things like financing and attracting subscribers, calculating churn, doing customer support. There is a playbook, in his view, for all of that. And what we're creating is a society as a service, a new SaaS, right? The main thesis here is that the network is the next Leviathan. What does history have to do with anything of that? We're talking about, after all, creation of the nation state. We're talking about technology. And he kind of preempts this question and explains why history matters. And he's spot on here, I think, that the short version of the answer to this question is that if a tech company is about technological innovation first and the company culture second, a startup society is the reverse. It's about the community culture first and technological innovation second. And while innovating on technology means forecasting the future, innovating on culture means probing the past. So it's the whole book, the whole chapter is about the past, the history. And then he goes on to explain even in more detail why history is important. For example, history determines morality and legality. And this is precisely why history is crucial for startup societies. He correctly points out that the startup nations are more than just a collection of people solving some sort of technological problems through an app. They're more than just about technology. He contrasts in particular history written to a ledger like BTC's, Bitcoin's history of transactions, and this history is immutable. He compares and contrasts it to history written by winners, by authorities, who are rather disturbing and distorting history. And he's try to introduce an operationally useful set of tools for thinking about the past from bottom up, but also from a top-down perspective. So it's history written to the ledger and history written by the winners. He now says that if we do that, recorded on, say, a ledger like the blockchain, or Bitcoin blockchain in particular, then we can record not just blockchain, all the events that occur in blockchain, but also non-blockchain events. And of course, those of you who are familiar with how blockchain works, you know that we can do that with the help of crypto oracles. So the full scale of what the Bitcoin blockchain represents is nothing else, in his view, than the history of an entire economy. Every transaction is recorded since time zero, and every fraction of the Bitcoin is accounted for down to 100 millionths of a Bitcoin, and nothing is lost. So in theory, you can eventually download, according to him, the public blockchain of a network state to replay the entire cryptographically verified history of a community. And that's a future, the future rather, of all public records, a concept that's really key to that is better than the paper-based legacy system that can be distorted. And then he does spend a little bit of time on trust, and particularly trust in God and state. And he's saying that faith in God and trust in state are dying. And it's the network that's the next Leviathan. That's the key thesis of this chapter. All the three are struggling together and will not be kept, according to him, in his view of form. We'll see a remix of them together and for people to create new kinds of social orders and new hybrids, new synthesis, and so on. And then he goes on to explain why things that are typical of the network states, the characteristic of the network states, how they compare to the status quo and how they're better. For example, encryption is better than state violence. Crypto economy is better than state economy. Virtual reality is better than physical proximity, and international is better than national, and so on and so forth. So he goes through quite a few characteristics of the new network state. One very interesting idea that's inherent in chapter 2 is that of one commandment, this idea of one commandment. And that's a historically founded socio-political innovation in his view. It draws citizens to a startup society, just like a technologically based commercial innovation attracts customers to a startup society. So here, this one commandment is important because you're not asking people to buy a product, which is an economic pitch that entrepreneurs very often make. But what you're asking people to do is to join a community, which is kind of cultural and collective pitch. And every new startup society needs to have some moral premise at its core when its founding nation subscribes to, when one that is supported by digital history that's more powerful and the state cannot delete it, one that justifies its existence as a peaceful protest against the powers that are there. You can come up with one commandment, he says, one new moral premise, just one specific issue where the history and science has convinced you that the establishment is really not doing a good job. And why this one issue, one commandment? Because by focusing on just one issue, you can set up a parallel society with manageable complexity, because you're changing only one civilization rules. And such one commandment societies are supported by history, and Srinivasan gives quite a few examples of such societies that were founded on just one principle, one premise, one commandment. And starting with one, you can introduce one tightly focused change at the time in a startup society, and then you can test on this new commandment and see whether it works or not. He spends quite a bit of time on parallel societies, and in particular, he's got this idea that, which I found kind of interesting, on the supremacy of capitalism over communism. How did the US beat the USSR? Because he says it built and defended a parallel system. It's an alternative society, according to Srinivasan, starting from different moral premises that eventually produced undeniably better results. And I couldn't ask them. Help asking myself, well, what are these moral premises? We've just talked about that the moral premise, the economic rationale is really the endless accumulation of capital. And I just really want to, since we're on the topic of history, I want to correct one historical wrong that I think is present in Balaji's books, and that's probably because, history was written by the winners. Let me give you an example here. In 1982, Ronald Reagan, who just became president, decided to ascertain how accurate are CIA's long-term economic forecasts for the USSR. The CIA claimed at the time that the USSR economy, despite all of these difficulties, was on the rise, and by the late 90s, would reach rather impressive heights. Reagan charged 3 independent foresight groups to do that. One was headed by Gell-Mann. Many would know this name, Nobel Prize laureate, and he co-founder of this Santa Fe Institute. Then Randall Collis, the sociologist, and Bonner. So they investigated this forecast, and all 3 came up with exactly similar results. All of them independent, mind you. All of them forecasted a very steep crisis in 87, 88, and then in 93 and 94. They also predicted that the socialist camp would fare rather well, a lot better than the capitalist world. In the capitalist world, the GDP would drop by 20%. For the socialist camp, that would be something like 10 to 12%. And this is when the US administration decided to deal with the Soviet problem once and for all, or the Soviet question, as they used to call it. They issued a secret directive, at the time secret, US relations with the USSR, and outlined its main objective: not to destroy the USSR, but to change its socio-political regime. And what happened in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union is that if we analyze the processes not from some kind of a ideological or political perspective, but from a historical lens, well, it started, this is when the systemic crisis of capitalism started. And it started with the most vulnerable spot, which at the time was the USSR. The USSR was, of course, an anti-capitalist system, but it was part of the global system, and it was fulfilling the functions of the periphery. Therefore, its cheap resources were up for grabs, and its collapse was a way for global powers, especially the US, of course, to extend its markets to new territories. So the USSR collapse in 1991 was also self-made. It was not just external, but very much internal as well, because since the 1970s, the Soviet elites themselves, who were at the time very pro-West, they intentionally gave up the possibility of a breakthrough into something that was better than capitalism or post-capitalism. Thus, what we have is that by the late 90s, early 2000s, the super profits from what the Western analysts called the rape of Russia, investments in China, which allowed the Western world to be flooded with all this cheap Chinese stuff, and a decrease in military spending, which then could be spent on social programs. All of that created the impression of an unprecedented breakthrough in success and abundance in the capitalist society. It was the end of history. That's the title of the book by Francis Fukuyama, which is quoted, by the way, in Srinivasan too. So a liberal democracy will be forever. It's an ideal society. It will last. And I think this is what Srinivasan refers to as an undeniably better results. Well, even if they were better, that not for long, and the West is now having the flavor of all these better results, unfortunately. But let's go back to parallel societies. This concept of parallel societies is important, and this parallel society is similar to a startup society, but it could be much, much larger in scale. It's parallel because it stands apart from mainstream society as a parallel version, or as a fork, as a technologist would have put it. It's not set up in opposition to the mainstream on every dimension, but differentiated from the mainstream rather on a key axis in Balaji's view. Startup societies, he says, come in three different shapes. One is a wholly digital network union. A second is partially physical network archipelago, and third is those that need diplomatically recognized network states. And not all startup societies, network states, do need to be diplomatically recognized. He stresses that such society is not a total revolution. We aren't starting completely de novo. Each startup society takes one single broken aspect of today's world, sometimes, very often really, it's caused by state, writing the history of that state failure, and then building an opt-in community to solve the problem. And just to maybe illustrate it, bring a little bit of life into this concept of parallel society, he gives an example of, say, keto-kosher archipelago, the sugar-free society. Let's assume, we need to create that sort of network archipelago with a physical footprint, not just a digital footprint, but not a full network state with diplomatic recognition. And this is where keto kosher or sugar-free society comes in. We could start with the history of the horrible USDA food pyramid. And of course, those of you who are into nutrition, into wellness, will know what this pyramid was all about. Very grain heavy, carb heavy at the bottom. That was really the foundation of the pyramid and monstrosity, and that gave cover to the corporate sugarification, as he says, of the globe, and that led to the obesity epidemic as well. And one of the cures is, of course, keto or low-carb diets. There are others, but that's one of them. Then you can operationalize this cure in the form of a partially physical network archipelago. You can organize a community online. This is how you start. But then you can crowdfund properties around the world, like apartment buildings, like small gyms, and perhaps eventually even some cul-de-sacs and small towns. You might take an extreme sugar teetotaler approach, where you can say, once you cross the border of our state, of our archipelago, you're not allowed to have any processed foods or sugar at the border. So that's a kind of keto kosher, if you will. That's an example that he gives in his book. And I think I'll stop here with chapter 2. Just a very brief conclusion. Let's stop here, digest what we've been through, the definition of the network state, what's parallel society, how do you write an immutable history on the ledger, why it's important, how you can start with one commandment. And my question to you, my audience, is, well, which of Srinivasan's ideas do you agree with? Perhaps you can implement them in building your own online communities, like the idea of having recorded all events and transactions on the ledger, or one commandment. I find this idea quite powerful. Or the idea of being co-founded on the idea of opt-in. You can easily opt-in into the society or network, but you can also very easily exit and free to exit. Well, this is all for today. Thank you very much for joining. I hope you enjoyed this this overview, this review of one of the most interesting books that I certainly read in 2022 so far. And I will be next online back next Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. Again, with part 2, we'll complete the review of Srinivasan's book. Thank you again.